The Supreme Court is wrestling with the role of religion in government. Good evening. I'm Mark Martin.
And I'm Heather Sells. The case the High Court is looking at involves prayers at the start of a New York Town Council meetings. Dale Hurd takes a look at what is at stake in tonight's top story.
The High Court is weighing a federal appeals ruling that said the Rochester, New York suburb of Greece violated the Constitution because nearly all the prayers at town hall meetings in an 11-year period were overtly Christian. One of the residents who prayed at the meetings was Pastor Patrick Medeiros.
In my prayers, I have asked God to bless our community, to bless our leaders, to grant them divine wisdom as they do the people's business there in our community.
But Aisha Khan of Americans United for Separation of Church and State called the prayers unconstitutional.
Participating in one's local government is a universal right of citizenship. It should not be conditioned on recitation of the Lord's Prayer or participation in any other prayer that is unique to a particular faith tradition.
But supporters of the town prayer say even atheists were invited to offer invocations. And the justices' comments and questions today indicated a majority did not agree with the appeals court ruling that the town prayers were unconstitutional.
The other side's arguments would require government to censor prayers, to decree what is orthodox and what is not when prayer givers are giving public prayer, and that would be contrary to our traditions of religious liberty.
A decision is expected by late June. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
And joining us now from Washington is Reverend Rob Schenck with the group Faith in Action. Rob, you were inside the Supreme Court today as attorneys made arguments in this case. What can you tell us about today's proceedings?
Well, Mark, it was certainly one of the most spirited debates I've seen on the bench. Well, we call it a debate. It's really a conversation with the justices. They're asking questions of the attorneys. The attorneys are responding, and it was vigorous. There were some very strong opinions on that bench, but all in all, when all was said and done, I was reasonably optimistic that the court may issue an opinion that preserves this very important American tradition that we've enjoyed since before we were a nation.
Well, talk a little bit more about that. What was said that gave you a clue as to how the justices are going to approach the case?
Well, actually, it started out pretty hostile. Justice Kagan was asking some pretty pointed questions about particular prayers that were offered at the Greece Town Council meetings, including explicitly Christian prayers, and that seemed to trouble her deeply, as it did a couple of the other justices. But very soon, other voices were heard, Justice Scalia among them, and defending the fact that we've had this freedom since the beginning of our republic, that it would be impossible to satisfy every group's particular perspective on prayer, especially an atheist. How do you, the argument seemed to be we need some kind of generic prayer that's acceptable to all groups. How do you do that with an atheist? How do you present any prayer that would be acceptable to an atheist group? And with the enormous diversity of religions in our country, the idea that you can come up with some kind of general prayer that everyone will be happy with is virtually impossible. And at the end, Justice Kagan, who started out quite negative, seemed to agree with that position. So when it all came out in the end, I remember Justice Kagan saying, when government gets involved in things like religion, things usually go worse, don't they? And everybody seemed to agree with that.
Well, Reverend Schenck, what are the implications of this case for religious freedom? Quickly.
Well, enormous, because, of course, we're talking about a very rich tradition that's existed now for the entirety of our nation's history, where citizens have had the right to open their legislative sessions, whether that's a town council meeting or the United States Congress, with prayer. And when it comes to prayer, the individual who's chosen to give that prayer has to have the right to express prayer in the way he or she knows and understands their relationship to God and to the individual, to the one that they are praying to. So for the government to dictate the content of prayer is very distressing. It seemed to bother a lot of the justices today. They didn't seem to be comfortable with the idea of a government officer telling people what is and what is not an acceptable prayer. The government doesn't do a lot of things well, and they most certainly wouldn't do this well. So in the end, I think while some of the justices were sympathetic with those who were objecting to prayer, in the end, I don't think they see a way that they could ever satisfy that. So I'm confident that in the end, we'll be able to preserve the right to pray according to the dictates of our own conscience, according to the way we understand our relationship to God. And that's what constitutes religious freedom.
All right. Reverend Rob Shank, thanks for being with us, sir.